This is a pure 5 kilohertz sine wave generated by Melda M oscillator being run into Voxengo span. Now, very early when I started this channel, I posted at least one video about my 5 kilohertz sine wave signal hygiene test protocol. What I use that for is to minimize aliasing distortion, aliasing artifacts, inharmonic frequency spikes, as can be observed in this span readout, especially from non-linear plugins like saturators, compressors, and the like. I was careful to point out that this protocol does not in any way entirely eliminate aliasing. It's just that I noticed what I would describe as a high pressure, very unpleasant glassiness in the high end of my mixes. That when those mixes were played through, most notably smartphone speakers, they would often generate what I learned is known as tizz, a kind of spitty, sputtery, grainy hiss that those tiny little speakers cannot smooth over. And I reasoned that if the mixes were generating that nasty sound in tiny little smartphone speakers, unforgiving little speakers like that, then those mixes probably wouldn't fare too much better in really high-end systems with things like ribbon tweeters and Class D amplifiers. So anyway, here's another caveat about this 5 kilohertz. I chose 5 kilohertz for reasons. You know, you could choose another frequency. 3 kilohertz would also be a good candidate. But anyway, what I generally go for is we've got our fundamental spike at 5K here, and then I try to get a nice second harmonic spike at 10K, right about there, and then a third harmonic spike around 15K, right around that amplitude. And to get it in kind of a descending staircase fashion. And, you know, a nice spike at 20K is also good. I was going to test my... Hang on a second. Mrs. Vinyl Bear is in a singing mood. She's singing in the background. I need to go close the door. All right. So anyways, I was preparing for my next video, which is going to be... It's going to be about Airwindows cojones. And I was running a signal hygiene check. And I noticed all kinds of, well, it didn't look pretty. You see here, I've got Airwindows ToVinyl4. This is in my mix bus. It's bypassed right now. So I ran the hygiene check on my vocal channel. I bypassed the entire chain. I bypassed the bus ends. I muted all the buses. It was still a mess. Well, I finally narrowed it down to ToVinyl4 in the mix bus, but specifically bypassing it, you can see this forest of spikes appear. But really what it is H limit. This is slew acceleration limiter that is meant to mimic the protective measures that are taken from burning out lathe needles, as I understand it. I had it set by ear to 0.63. Look what happens when I return it to default at 0.32. Well, that's quite a bit more manageable, and it's within my acceptable amplitude range for aliasing spikes, because by the time I get done with everything else, spikes of this magnitude are generally masked by other stuff I've got going on. So, what to do? What to think about this? I'm going to refer to a conversation that I had with Gemini about this, because sometimes Gemini really is on point, and it was streamlined, this exposition, for me to do that. So I'm going to pause and be right back. Okay, so I'm just going to read through this interaction with Gemini, and then I'll leave you to your own conclusions. So I wrote, it's the mix bus chain. The main culprit is ToVinyl4, specifically its H limit knob. Look at the before and after with H limit set to default 0.32 and 0.63 respectively. Why is H limit slaughtering my signal like that? Answer, the visual evidence in those two span shots is staggering. You've successfully isolated the slaughterhouse. Don't you love how the AI is just glom onto things like that and run with them? Anyway, the reason ToVinyl4 is shredding your signal specifically via the H limit knob is because of how Chris from Airwindows designed the acceleration limiter portion of that plugin. It isn't a standard peak limiter. It is a slew rate limiter designed to simulate the physical limitations of a vinyl cutting head. The slew versus sine conflict. A cutting head cannot physically move fast enough to etch extreme high-frequency transients at high amplitudes without overheating or jumping the groove. H-limit is the acceleration limiter that enforces this physical reality. The 5 kilohertz problem. A 5 kilohertz sine wave is actually a very fast-moving waveform in terms of voltage change per microsecond. When you crank H-limit from 0.32 to 0.63, you are essentially telling the cutting head that it is no longer allowed to move that fast. The resulting slaughter, since the waveform is trying to move faster than the H limit allows, the plugin clips the slew rate. In the digital domain, slew clipping a sine wave turns it into a triangle wave or a trapezoid. The harmonic forest. As soon as that smooth sine curve gets flattened or sharpened by the slew limiter, it generates those massive odd order harmonics that you see spiking in span. And then, well, I'll just pause it here and you can read this much, or you can pause it here and read this much. And it gives me some advice on what to do about it. You can pause and read. So that brought me to my next question, which is really the point of this video. And I wrote, the reason I had H limit set at 0.63 is because I liked it there. So here's my next question. Recently, I asked Chris during one of his YouTube live streams about the way 2 Tape 9 aliases at 48 kilohertz. I asked whether he thought this issue would be resolved at 96 kilohertz. To paraphrase his answer, he said that he didn't take that into consideration when coding to tape 9 and that I should go with my ears. So here I am with a similar issue. My question is this: is it possible, given your explanation of what H-limit was designed to do, running a 5 kilohertz sine wave through it does not yield a fair representation of how it reacts to a real audio signal? And Gemini's answer: that is exactly the core of the sine versus real world paradox. Paradox? I don't know if it's a paradox, but it's a consideration to be weighted for sure. Chris is right. The ears are the final arbiter, but the physics of why that 5 kilohertz sine wave looks like a disaster in span while sounding right on your Q-tom vocals is actually quite logical. A pure sine wave is the cruelest possible test for a slew rate limiter like H-limit. The energy density problem. In a pure 5 kilohertz sine wave, 100% of the energy is concentrated at a single lightning-fast slope. Because the waveform is constantly moving at its maximum rate of change, H-limit is engaged 100% of the time. It never gets a break. It is essentially being asked to cut a groove that is an infinite series of high-velocity turns. In a real audio signal, energy is distributed across the spectrum. High frequencies are usually much lower in amplitude than the fundamental. Transients are intermittent. The acceleration limiter only kicks in for a few milliseconds at a time to shave off the stabbiness of a sibilant S or a sharp pick attack. It spends most of its time doing nothing, which is why it sounds transparent and euphonious on music, but looks like a murder scene on a test tone. Okay, so that's the caveat. And it doesn't surprise me. I mean, I think I knew this somewhere in the back of my mind, but it's worth pointing out. The sine wave test, again, it can be useful. In my experience, it has been useful for improving my sound, for taking away that glassy, high-pressure glare that I didn't like, for virtually eliminating the tizz problem on tiny speaker playback. It has been a very useful protocol, but I need to start using it with a bit more intelligence and situational awareness, with more of a sense of context for what I'm running it through. And so I thought I'd throw this out there for whatever the hell it's worth. And that's it. Thank you for watching and listening. Those of you who have been leaving feedback and comments lately, I really do appreciate it. It makes it all worthwhile for me. I don't need tons of views. I don't care about that. It's nice just to have a few people that listen and understand and respond. So I really do appreciate it. That's it from lowly humble Vinyl Bear Studio here in lovely scenic Paju City, South Korea. Hoping this video finds you well, and may the winds of clarity blow ever in your favor. Over and out.